think that they are close to you, that they are actually, in fact, not. However you're going to define proximity, it can be violated. So he calls it the stranger. He wrote, it's a neat little paper. There's political and governmental problems. Privacy is a big concern. Recently in social media, there's the social shaming, how the network, people within this network can shame on somebody, and then there can also be a backlash as well. But how do the members deal with alienation? Is there a recuperation? Is there remediation? Is there an ability for them to recover socially within this social network? We have authority, and there's the management, the access, and the structure behind this. Who has control over these different concerns? And modality. This touches a little bit on the AI side that you're talking about. When we have VR, how do we navigate between these networks? On to slide 12. So social network analysis, that's the next step. That's ultimately what one of the big components of the Wellman paper starts to propose, is how do we validate a social network? Wellman comes from a more anthropological side. Part of that is due to the timing, but I think it's also due to how he sees and constructs and approaches studying social networks. As a goal to understand it. If you're hired at Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, Plus, you choose it. What are some of the things that you're going to want to do, right? You want to identify those stakeholders and those trendsetters, right? If you can convince that one person to do that one thing, then you can make a lot else, a lot of other people follow along quickly, right? That's scary that can happen, especially if it's quantifiable, searchable, and easily identifiable. Some of the other papers that I listed, they have this suggestion that we focus on the interactions and the people. But this interaction, what is typical when the network is presented with a particular situation? How does it react? I think you might be familiar with Facebook when they talk about augmenting or changing their presentation, how it affects. And then what's important, this came from Ramakrishnan, Dr. Ramakrishnan here. He has a paper that talks about the importance of storytelling, the social concerns. And they have this neat need for the idea of breadcrumbs, these milestones, these mile markers that help us understand and provide context, which sometimes and often is informal in a social network. It's not as easy to subscribe to a network. Facebook allows it with like all these subgroups, right? But you can still be a part of certain networks without doing an official subscription to it. And knowing that is not easy. But they do it from an analysis standpoint, predominantly also from a military standpoint of trying to do analysis on hard drives to help understand what it is this person is doing, but it helps them to understand the position of where this person stands.
What's the difference between storytelling and event-based search?
Say that again, louder.
What's the difference between storytelling and event-based searching or grammar? Because if you're saying it's storytelling, you're basically saying you're just putting up the events together.
Other than the naming,
Yeah, is there a difference?
I'm not 100% sure on the taxonomy definition of event-based search here. Part of it, though, I would argue is the weighting, because from what I understand about event searches, you apply some algorithm that gives weight to one event more so than another.
No, that is if you're looking for a specific event. I'm just saying, what's the difference between just merging a bunch of events together
Oh,
versus...
gotcha. So he's saying, what's the difference between a log of specific events and storytelling? Because if I told you what I did today, you could care less about the 500 things I've done. What I do want to tell you is that I woke up and my friend sent me a great, hey, I wish you a great day text. That's the important thing. That's the story, right? That's the difference between a very bland academic journal and a great novel that you read.
Yeah,
right?
but again, like you've mentioned, it's from the perspective of the individual. It depends on both of them being involved in it, right?
Exactly. That's the more story-based. The event is just a catalog or a log.
No, I think what he's trying to say is, when you apply two methods, the listener has to decide which one is which, right? Because even you're applying a storytelling method, my perception could be, oh, he's just listing a bunch of stuff. So I can misunderstand you by saying, okay, he's doing the log-based stuff or event-based stuff. So you have to engage in the listener or the receiving end to have, say, some kind of consensus that, oh, we're doing storytelling.
That's the next slide, sort of. I'm going to call it noise. And it's partly just, in the storytelling, it's miscommunication. It's me failing to recognize your perception and adapt that story to you. So on to the next one. Or I guess it's in the next slide, sorry. So there's many different metrics. Here's the 6 that were in the paper. Here's some additional ones that kind of, not necessarily, they're newer, they're not from the anthropological side. They have slightly different meanings. I won't spend too much time on it given the time limit here. But you'll also see many of these common words thrown around when you're talking about SNA. So you're talking, what you were talking about right here is the noise. So how do you verify that something, that your assessment of the social network is valid, important, relevant? So if I've given you too much of that log, it would be noise, and you'd misinterpret it. If I make it too terse, maybe I've left out something that's important for a different algorithm. You can describe a social network algorithmically, graphically, as in what you've talked about with graphs, right? How is it that you describe it? Is it important? So, 53, okay. We talked about that most methods focus on the nodes. One of the other papers, let me cite it real quick. The Vander Alst paper suggests to focus on the interactions. If I were to look at a log of what a person did, that's not as important as looking at the log of the interactions between the people. So that I initiated a chat with you, that I've talked about a particular story or an event that's meaningful to our relationship. Self-efficacy to the users, there's this problem. Where do you stand in a social network? If I ask you to describe LinkedIn's network and you draw me a graph, can you point me to the X and Y, or maybe Z if it's a 3-dimensional graph? Can you show me where you're at? And just because you're there now, does that mean that's where you remain? As you presumably you wouldn't, right? The graph, it's a network, it'll change, it'll adapt, right? But as it changes, how are you going to know where you stand within it? From a political standpoint, you can say, I'm in Blacksburg, Virginia, and I have this right to vote in this location, but when I move, I now am here. And you can say where your voice is from a political standpoint because of your location. It's not as easy when you move into a virtual computer-supported network to locate and give yourself identity. And then how do you, once you've made some analysis, how do you verify? How do you say that my analysis is complete compared to someone else's analysis? Do you get stakeholder or member feedback from that? So the suggestions from the different papers focus on some of the interactions, look at the tasks that the people are performing, and this was an interesting paper where they talk about the affiliation network, where they're saying you take the traditional model of the social network, and then you take this new one that focuses on the interactions and the tasks. You map it down and then back up, and you have this integrated model so that you can look at them where they're positioned in relation to other members, however you see fit. But you also get to see how they relate to other people in interaction base or task base. We're on to the identity slide, slide 15. So if I ask you to represent your online identity in a social network, how would you do it? How would you do that? This is an open-ended question.
Based on the basic details like where I come from, my interests, general interests, my education and workplace, I think reasonably complete.
So you're sounding like you're listing out, you have an itemized list.
Yes.
Okay.
I would draw myself.
You would draw yourself. And what would you draw around you? Or just drawing yourself is your identity?
Yeah, because I suck at backgrounds, and so it ended up being some type of weird, impressionistic whatnot.
So somewhat limited by your artistic ability, but you would include yourself around something and things you like, I would presume?
Things I think
I
are
think
cool.
maybe
Cool.
I would picture like that.
You would add a picture. So we have an artistic drawing, we have a list of items. That's kind of what I have down here. It's important to give the person their own identity. Facebook does not do that whatsoever. I will argue that. They give you a banner, this other picture, right? And then your story, everything is told in this 1/3 of a page column in chronological order. And you can think nowadays what you can say, I want this shown or not. To me, that is not how I represent myself in an identity. I'm much more complex, and it's difficult to show the complexity of me on a single page. But I have many different ways that I would attempt to do that. And that's one of the reasons I don't participate in Facebook.
So, but it depends on what you choose to show on your social network. They cannot go and find what is your real identity is. Here you are showing on the Facebook or any social network, you are exhibiting what you want to be.
So yes, let me branch off from you as well. My identity on Facebook is the absence of me being on Facebook. By me abstaining from Facebook, that is showing you that I abstain from Facebook.
Can you rephrase this a little bit? I think this is a really interesting question about your online identity, right? But there's another question, which is, what does social network analysis, which is a method for looking at groups of people, tell us about, in different contexts, one of which might be a social, a computer implementation of a social network, right? So how can you use social network analysis to understand the properties of this thing, Facebook, which we call a social network, and which maybe, Wellman, and certainly has certain common properties in common with what Wellman's talking about, but it may also have differences. So what can social network analysis tell us about our identity, right? Is a really key question here.
I'll start that answer. If you look at the like last page, there's some other definitions that I've included. One of the ways that you can do analysis on a social network is through strong and weak ties. And that takes the relationship in a number of metrics between two nodes. So in Facebook's case, it'll be between two people. What, up until recently, the majority of the social network analysis focused on the strong ties, the strong relationships. You and I like barbecue. Yes, we eat it. You and I like to play soccer. Great. But it doesn't, it's been saying, okay, we don't like soccer. And that's like, oh, well, you're just over here. But maybe there's a reason why we don't like soccer. And that is a strong tie. It's the inverse. So there's a trend to start to focus on. There is information in these networks of weak ties based on certain metrics that you choose to focus on. So bringing that back to what I was saying before, the fact that I abstain from certain interactions with Facebook is important to my identity. And depending on how you focus on a network, whether you're focusing on the weak ties or the strong ties, can depend upon how you come to a conclusion about what the social network is doing. Yes?
Since we're talking about identity in a social network, I feel that we should think about how we connect with people on Facebook. I mean, when we connect with somebody on Facebook, that person is almost
I don't think
most of
that's
the time.
identity, I think that's coordination. So if you want to hold that thought, unless you can think that it is identity, we're about to talk about coordination.
Okay, I think that we have met that person before in real life, before we actually become friends with that person on Facebook most of the time. So identity is something which we have experienced on a personal basis beforehand, and we do not add people on Facebook just by looking at their profiles. We add people on Facebook which we have interacted with somewhere before in real life.
What does that have to do with identity, I guess is my question.
So their identity is not as much tied to their Facebook profile, but to who they are in real life as well.
So you're saying that you can know about someone's social skills or social breadth based on the number of people they have?
Certainly no.
But I don't, what Amna's saying it is Amna, right?
Yes.
Has to be taken so literally as that. You can define a person's identity externally through just by describing their social connections, and that's something that sociologists or anthropologists sometimes try to do because they reject a more internal definition of identity. So you could say that your social network is a definition of identity, and then try to characterize its properties. So if you look at my Facebook connections, which are very limited, you might say that my identity as defined by Facebook almost exclusively consists of people who do not live in Blacksburg, right? And that I have connections that are not in Blacksburg is indeed a property of my identity, although it would be kind of upsetting if we try to define my identity completely as people who do not live in Blacksburg.
So, let's see if I can do it this way. So how do we give the agency back to the person so that they can create their own identity knowingly within the social network? One of the papers from Vegas and also Fisher, they talk about how they can use visualizations to help the user understand where they are within the network and navigate some of the concerns that they have about the network. Let me skip over this slide for the time. Coordination, talking about what we had talked about earlier, about proximity. One of the papers, they do this neat study where they harvest your phone data and they say, okay, label this person as a weak tie, a medium tie, or a strong tie. Basically, do you know this person a little, okay, or a lot? And you can see that, and then they map those people to also Facebook interactions. The number of friends that you have with Facebook and Phonebook can be a lot, and it has this linear digression. But what's interesting here is with Facebook, as soon as you start to get to a stronger relationship, the number of times you communicate with them drops if you're only looking on their Facebook. So I can talk to you a lot on Facebook, but if you want to talk outside of Facebook about life, about something else in a stronger sense, it happens a lot less than if you're looking at the phone. So the modality, how you communicate, is very important. And I've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly. Efficiency. When you join Facebook, when you join LinkedIn, you got these EULAs. There's this trade-off. I need what they have to offer, but does it violate my moral beliefs? If it does, how much does it? How do you understand, by participating in this particular EULA, that it is violating your moral violation? When we scroll past it, we're scrolling past a lot that may violate us. Taking the time, just by taking the time to understand it, we're losing time. And how do you manage all of these now and in the future? One of the neat things is a growing trend on apps. Just to install it, they install it. Then when you're like, oh, I want to post a picture, it says, wait a second now you need to get into we need to access your photos, right? So this staggered acceptance to any particular EULA. In that same study, it's a graph, you can look at it later, but it looks at SMS and duration. So how often and in what type, and it's using the same metrics for weak, medium, and strong. And then I'll end with the so what. It's very important that the users understand who they are and how they relate within the social network, so that the social network can be more positive. That term is very loose. I didn't discuss that. I kind of jumped over that because of the time constraint. But what does it mean to be positive? Is the social network moving to where it wants to go? And if not, if it branches off, is that new social network meeting the needs of its members? And the last slide, we don't have time for it, but is the last minute and a half from the movie The Social Network. It's very powerful. Basically what happens is Mark Zuckerberg had a falling out with a previous girl, But at the very end, after he's gone through all these legal cases and problems, you see him on his own website try to become friends with that girl and constantly hits refresh. There's a lot in what happens, why is he hitting refresh, what does he want, what could be interpreted from that interaction log. I invite you to consider that. Any other quick questions, comments, concerns? Amna, you want to come up here? Well, we can switch.
Any sign of the people to fix the IB?
No. And
So, thank you.
yeah, it says it's still configuring.
Here was a question.
Who? Javier? Yeah, go for it.
So there was one of your, I think, last 10 slides or something where you posed that there was a question where it says, who can form
That one's mine.
this identity? There were like 3 or 4 questions.
Yes.
One's like, who has the ability to form this identity? That was kind of interesting to me, but I don't think you touched much on it.
No,
Some of the things that we've been discussing, so.
part of it from Fisher's perspective that I agree with is there's not enough agency in the online that allows you to control your identity. And I think to make a social network more robust and more representative of those individuals, I want there to be more individualization. I do like how the social structure can rebound. I kind of had mentioned that in recent, I was talking to, apparently there was a rather large, heavyset individual who was male who was dancing, and the community initially started to make fun of him, but then he gained a lot of supporters and was eventually, they all ousted or tried to oust the people who were making fun of him. What I want is the ability for those types of problems with identity to be addressed by the individual without having to go always to waiting for a crowdsourced response.
Cool.
I think Amna stepped out for a minute.
What do you have to do to get that screen to turn on?
What screen?
The little touch screen that's supposed to go off in 2 hours.
You just touch it.
Okay.
So technically, I'm supposed to start at 5:30. So we can take a break for 15 minutes, I think.
So Deborah, it looks like we're going to take a 10-minute break. Javier, I don't know if y'all can hear me. They might be on mute.
Extra time.
Nobody is not walking around.
There you are.
They don't have the internet connection.
You there? Javier. We're going to take a break. It looks like for about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. I'm going to figure out I'll work on the thing again, and if not, I'll leave this facing.
Hey, whatever the computer was before, the connection with the video was very clear, but whatever you're now, it dropped quality abruptly.
The video dropped abruptly.
Yeah, the video, I mean, it's very low quality right now, where you had it before at the podium, I suppose. It was very high quality.
All right, I'll work on that.
Thank you, then.
Yep.
Yeah.
To see what was the number of voices actually required. So if I use RDC equals true, like to enable the dynamic.
RMC equals to true. That's like whoever's
Relocatable device.
Hey, can y'all try the beam? Because it's saying it's good on our end.
Like if you want to do dynamic,
that flag controls
Can you hear me?
for the current performance.
So try logging into the beam. It may have had a problem because we were both logged in, but
Current cooling.
from what I'm seeing now, it looks like it is completely working.
Yeah.
So I don't want to kick you out trying to access it.
Like nested kernels, like if you have a kernel that needs to.
Does it just say configuring?
Kernel from within the
dynamic
kernel.
algorithm,
Yes, yes.
Why would we call it
I forgot the word name. Yeah, that's right, yes, the name for 11. So I don't need
What
it.
food
Just
version
says
are you using?
configuring.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
I'll put it together this
Okay. Yeah, please.
What graphics card are you using?
This will be the
T20C, K20C, that's computation power, 3.5. That has the shared memory stuff. So, because CUDA 6.5 or 6, you can introduce the shared memory. Unified memory and dynamic,
But this is not a problem. I'm not using any dynamic for 11. It was just Pi state. I tried it. And I found that we can use the RDC to like enable dynamic for 11 to fix it.
how about Safari never works? This room is cursed. I can use Chrome. I can use Chrome, I can use Firefox, but I cannot use Safari.
It's only in the Mac Cloud.
No, this room, this particular room. So, I don't know what this. We don't want to have to do it.
Chris,
Yes.
now it says it's offline.
Alright.
It says it's offline. I'll just leave, we're obviously online, connect it to you.
Yeah.
Chips is not good. Their chip is like crap. No, it's ask someone else. Ask her. You like Mo's chip, like chip and Mo's?
Chip.
Chip and Mo's?
Oh, chips at mine.
Yeah.
Eh,
Man, I'm telling you.
Dude, I like you.
0 to 10, rate it.
5.
5.
Chip okay?
It's okay. It would be better if they baked it, at least more.
I'm not eating chips.
They have dips like this song. So they have
Dips.
Now they're dips. I would rate that a 7.
See?
Okay, so chips plus dips.
6.
6?
No, actually, it's like
You
each.
can never do that.
No, it's each. It's each. Yeah.
I'd rather just go to Kroger and get one of those like salsa stuff.
Dude, today's no Mondays, so it's like $6.
I don't know.
So BDOT has sales on Thursday and Mo's has sales on Monday.
Meetups is like Tuesday and Thursday.
Sharpies. Wait, it's a Sharpies.
Sharky's, I hate that place. Sharky's the one right across the street from Lowe's.
Was it
The burger
And alcohol.
and burrito and pool table.
Full table. That's fine.
Yeah, because they're
Just a
working.
pool table is not
not
any
working.
special pool table.
Do you know how to play football?
I don't play pool table. I only play with pool table. Why do you not play with the table? No, I
No,
don't.
you just, okay, so
We got pool.
we play pool, you don't say pool tables.
Yeah, it's like you play chess, don't play with chessboard. Because playing chessboard is weird. Yeah.
You can try it.
I mean,
Can you
why-
spin?
Okay, okay.
You need to
Spin
spin. Yeah.
How
Hold
big
it
is
with
the
your
board?
hand. Spin it.
Mhm. This one.
Just
But
draw,
why
draw one.
chessboard,
I don't
board
understand why.
is specific?
No, I didn't say you think you should go. I got the idea. I just
Okay, so you can play with chessboard by spinning.
yes, spin it and try to draw some kind of symbol on one side so that if
You talk it like you mean it.
I played once.
We played chessboard.
Yes, we didn't have any.
You were running stuff on the board.
No. Do you know the spinning button?
No.
Like you spin the
So you
button.
play football with chessboard?
We didn't have buttons and we only had a chess, so we drew some kind of an arrow at one end
Oh, right.
and we used it like this.
Wow. So you,
We didn't have anything to
so what do you do with football?
anymore.
Does it just not work in the
Just like
room?
spinning button.
Could,
You spin it.
So if it's pointed in a flag, what do you do?
I only know that because I live here on Mondays.
Oh,
but,
no. Next round.
You ask any random question.
Oh, you ask questions.
Yeah, okay, yeah, this question. Oh.
Then you ask them about the register stuff.
Yes, any question that doesn't know.
So why does I turn off this flag? It will give me, what, 35 seconds or something?
Ah, you mean like
No,
you
from
can
in the bottle, you can ask any questions, right? So you have to ask this question.
you know, playing with CS department colleagues.
Okay.
So you go to play